as you look at the photograph, you can see examples of a number of these still in the water. It is this kind of boat that Paul apparently is initially on, but he's going to make a transition to another kind that's going to ultimately end up in a shipwreck. But Paul is not, he's a privileged prisoner in the sense that the centurion is allowing him some opportunities, allows him to go ashore, and friends take care of him. And not all the prisoners would have that privilege. But Paul, being a Roman citizen and having appealed to Rome, and probably because Festus and Bernice and Agrippa have recognized that this is a non-issue, at least as far as the Romans are concerned, have probably given him license to be treated kindly.
Yes, really good insight into that. It's interesting to see the actual seaport there at Caesarea Maritima, where Paul was, to see the actual site. And like we've talked about, this is, we're dealing with history here, and so now we're going to come to a point in our study to where we're going to get into the voyage, Paul's voyage to Rome. We've been studying about that for some time, and visit with that here on a couple ideas. It should have been a few weeks voyage, but it's going to take months. We're going to see what happens that's going to cause it to take months. And a lot of scholars have talked about Luke's writing of this. And remember what Luke's profession is? He's a physician. So Luke's a very intelligent man, and he's writing this, remember, to possibly a Roman to explain to him about Christianity. He wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he writes now to act in Acts also to continue that. So, but they marvel at his knowledge of history. Of course, he's an inspired writer, his knowledge of history, but also as he writes about these maritime, the sailing, the thing that involved in sailing, he's got some real insight into the type of things that they faced when they sailed the sea. So it's going to be interesting as we kind of look at that to see his background. We're also going to get from this incident, we're going to get kind of a time frame, and we've been looking at this chronology of the dating of when all this occurred. We get a good time frame here because of the time of the year they'd sail, and a couple other points of the text. There's the feast that's going on, was probably the Day of Atonement, and scholars have looked back to the Day of Atonement at this time. They know what day it was. It was around October the 5th. When the Day of Atonement was celebrated. And this year, AD 59 is about the year they think, because this coincides with when Festus and Felix would have swapped their roles as governor. So that's all written in the history books. We know the dates those occurred. So that's how you can come up with a dating of the book. And so even in this occasion with Paul sailing the seas, we'll see the idea they're sailing at the time of the fast, which would have been before the feast of the Day of Atonement. So they have a pretty good idea. This is in the fall of the year. And so we're going to see some weather issues that are kind of come into play in this as well. So a lot of neat insight there that I think is really interesting to see the text come alive to us as Luke writes to us, and he's going to explain what Paul's going to go through in that regard. So let's look at some text here. The chronology we've talked about, this is probably around 59 AD. We'll come back to that. We'll be referring to this map a little bit more now, since we're actually in the point of where we're going to start the voyage. We're going to see he starts from here. We're going to go to Sidon, and we're going to talk about a little bit of this and the routes they take. It'll be interesting. We're going to understand why they take the route that they do. So I'll give us some insight into some of the things that's going on here. So we'll come back to this map on a couple of occasions here. We're going to see the names of these places that's going to come up in Scripture. We're going to be able to get a picture, and hopefully it helps you. It helps me to get a visual of where were they, and we're going to see on the map. We're going to follow on the map this voyage that Paul's going to take as best we can. We can follow the Scripture in that regard. Let's look at a couple of Scriptures background for a second. Paul's had this desire to go to Rome. It's been his desire. We saw in Acts 19, verse 21. Now, after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. So Paul's always had this in his mind that he wanted to go to Rome. In 1 Thessalonians 2, 17 through 18, which he wrote Thessalonians in probably about AD 51, 52, So 7 years or so before this voyage takes place, Paul has written this letter to the Thessalonians. But we, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short while in person, not in spirit, were all the more eager with great desire to see your face. For we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, more than once, and yet Satan hindered us. So gives us a little insight there. Satan, and you can read scholars that write about, obviously Satan didn't want Paul to get to Rome. And there's a lot of good reasons why Rome would be a great place for Paul to go and help spread the gospel. Why might that be? Why might Rome be a good place for the gospel to go? Yeah. Yeah. Alex? Heart of the empire.
And it's going to have the most influence. That's why in church history, the Roman church always had the most preeminence because it was the seat of power, and all the roads lead to Rome metaphorically.
Exactly. Yeah, all roads lead to Rome, don't they, Alex? Like Alex said, it's the seat of the empire. So people that come into Rome, think about the gospel spreads out from there. You're going to get all these people coming into Rome, just like Alex said, and going out there. So his desire is to get to Rome. The gospel can really spread if I can get to Rome. Satan doesn't want him to get to Rome. And we've seen, and he gives that, and he talks, we've studied all this with Paul, what he's faced that looks like he may not get there. But remember this passage in Luke 23. This is after his arrest, his first trial in Jerusalem. But on the night immediately following, he's been arrested. He's at the Fortress San Antonio that night. But on the night immediately following, this is after his trial with the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Lord stood at his side. This is one of those visions he has with the Lord comes to him at night and says, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly testified to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also." So what does that tell Paul? He's going to get to Rome. Now, he doesn't know how, and in his own mind, what he's facing, it'd probably be like us, is like, I'm never going to get there. All this stuff is against me. How am I ever going to get out of Caesarea? I've been here for 2 years in a prison for nothing, and they keep wanting to have a trial. But he's been told, the Lord's told him, you're going to get to Rome. You're going to get to Rome. And Satan doesn't want him to get there. And so we're going to continue. We've seen all the things that Paul faces. Well, the hardships are not over. The hardships are not over. And Satan's going to do what he can to keep Paul from getting there. And I think that's a really important point for us to think about. Thoughts or comments on that? Oben?
You get to look at their road of travel. It was like slower.
Slower, yeah.
Slower, riding camel.
There was no fast travel, was there? So as we finished last week, his trial before Agrippa, we know that Festus, he needed something to write to the Roman emperor as he sends his prisoner who's appealed to Caesar. He has to write something, and that's why he wanted Agrippa's help. So we don't know what he writes. We don't know that for sure. But so we don't know how long after the trial with Agrippa it takes for them to send him. But they had to wait not only for Festus to get his letter written, but they also had to wait for transport. They would wait, usually, some say, for several prisoners before they just send one. So they'd wait till they had several prisoners that needed to go that direction, and they need to find transport. So there was some time that passed as they prepared to send him. All those things had to come together, and then we see those things come together here in Acts 27 as we begin that text there. So let's begin our text in Acts 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking on the Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. Now, in verse 1, when it was decided that we would sail, who would the we be? Yeah, Luke's a part of the trip. Luke's writing this. Here we see Luke's joined up with him on occasion. We've seen him reference that through the book of Acts on occasion when Luke's been reunited back with Paul. So now Luke's making the trip also. And also we see Aristarchus. Now, Aristarchus, we found in Acts 20, verse 4, Aristarchus was one of the Greeks who came back to Jerusalem with Paul. There's about 7 of them that traveled from Asia back to Jerusalem carrying the contributions. Remember, we talked about, he brought those Greeks with him, and Aristarchus was one of those who came back with him. Now, it's interesting, Colossians 4, verse 10 says, Aristarchus, Paul's writing to the church at Colossae, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas' cousin Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Aristarchus becomes a prisoner at some point. Now, not sure whether he was a prisoner now, but he travels with Paul, but at some point he's going to become a prisoner with Paul as well. And most probably agree he becomes a prisoner with Paul in Rome, probably on Paul's second imprisonment in Rome, possibly. So here we see that he's accompanied by Luke, and these were not passenger ships. These were cargo ships. We'll talk about that here a little bit in a second. But others, the others that are on the ship could have been condemned criminals. And we talked about Rome would have waited for several prisoners to be there, and probably criminals that were condemned to death, maybe be taken back to Rome to be put into the arena to be part of the games with the wild beasts that Rome would throw people there for the entertainment. And possibly some scholars speculate these could have been condemned criminals, because when the shipwreck occurs, the intention of the guards is to kill those prisoners. So they were already condemned probably. That's why they're willing to just kill them once the shipwreck happens. Except for Paul. Now, Paul, we know we're going to see, is given some preferential treatment. And did you catch in the video, Dr. Manor, referring to that? Why would Paul might receive some preferential treatment? I'm sorry? He's a Roman citizen, exactly. And he's not been condemned of anything, has he? They haven't condemned him. He's appealed to Caesar. He's a Roman citizen. And so we'll see that he's probably given some consideration for that. He's not considered a condemned man like some of the others on the ship probably are. Other thoughts or comments there? Yeah, Ed?
Is it likely that Luke had to come up with money or somebody to support him? They wouldn't have paid for his transportation.
Well, I think
Somebody has to be supporting.
that's a good question, but I think Rome, when they transported the prisoners, would provide for the transportation. Now, we're going to find out when Paul gets there and is on house arrest, he has to provide for his own housing under house arrest and pay for his rent. At the end of Acts, we're going to find out how Paul pays for his own place, and we think the church helped him with that. But I think in the transportation part, they didn't have to, the prisoner didn't have, he's still a prisoner, he's under Rome guard, they're going to provide the transport.
But Luke is not.
Luke is not. No, that's a great point. That's the other reason why they think Luke and Aristarchus could be on. You could pay for passage. And you're right, great point, Ed. Ed wasn't on there. Luke, you weren't there, Ed. Luke and Aristarchus could have paid for passage. You could do that. Great point. And they think that's probably what happened there. Aristarchus might not have been a prisoner at this time. They could have paid for passage, but the condemned individuals and the prisoners, Rome is taking care of that. And that's why Rome would wait and make those connections. Yeah, really good point. That's a great point I wanted to bring up. They could have paid for passage, Luke and Aristarchus. Greg?
I was just going to say throughout all of this, what makes me is their faith.
Yeah.
I mean, it's how many of us would go through what they're going through and stay headstrong on what you're supposed to do, or what is ahead of you, knowing what's ahead of you, and still keep the faith.
Yeah, there was nobody who was going to tell.
Part of this story is the faith that Paul has.
He was convicted, wasn't he, Greg? He was convicted of who Jesus was and that he raised from the dead, and there was nobody that was going to silence him. That's a great point. His faith was strong to endure what he was willing to endure for that, and Christ continued to encourage him, and he told him he would do that when he saw him on the road to Damascus. He told him Jesus would encourage him along the way. Steve?
This is just total speculation, but it seems like Agrippa kind of like Paul. And I don't know, maybe he said, take it easy on this guy. Who knows? I mean, we don't know, but.
Hey, exactly. And I talked about the irony last week that this is a descendant of the Herods who hated Christianity, who had put James the apostle to death. His own father, Agrippa's father, had done that. He knew the antagonistic attitude of his family towards Christians, but yet he responds that Paul's done nothing wrong. And that's an interesting transition here. And it's interesting also, I mentioned last week, that King Agrippa is the last of the reign of the Herods. He has no male offspring. The line of Herod will end right here. And the last line of Herod ends with somebody who's not antagonistic against the Christ, at least in Paul's trial. So great point, great thought to think about. Interesting to see that history and that dynamic. Other thoughts or comments? So as we look at that, it's just the centurion. Now it's interesting, the Augustan centurion. Back to your point, Ed, the Augustan cohort. Now this is interesting. Obviously, a commander, centurion is commander of 100 men. The Augustan cohort, August means the emperor. So they think there's these cohorts that were from the Roman emperor who would go around throughout their region bringing soldiers back to Rome, bringing prisoners back to Rome. So this Augustan cohort, he is a representative from the emperor who has come to take prisoners back to Rome. So that's a reference there also that they're providing the transport. They call them an imperial cohort whose officers traveled throughout the empire probably, and they were probably told that Paul was uncondemned and the Roman citizen and should be given preferential treatment. That's what a lot of scholars believe in regard to what we're going to see. Paul's able to do things that the others aren't able to do on this ship. So let's move into the other part of the passage. So the next day, well, wait a second. Let's see if I covered what we needed to. Yeah, just fixing to set sail. So the next day, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration. Here's that special consideration, with consideration, and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. So here we go. I shouldn't have done that. I've got a slide ahead of time, so we're going too far back. So they go to Sidon. The first portion of the voyage, they go to Sidon and they're going to take port there in Sidon. And then we're going to see as they take place there. So he's going to go to Sidon. And so what does it say there that the commander allows Paul to do? Go to his friends and receive care. So when they go to port, Paul's able to see some friends. Obviously, Paul's been establishing churches and he's got friends in all these ports. And some think that maybe Paul, we've had this discussion about Paul's ailments. We don't know, but Paul was a sickly person, no doubt, with all that he faced. They think he had malaria early on. We studied about that in the beginning of his deal. This idea of the malaria he had may have had some reoccurrence in his life. He had eyesight issues. He had with all of his beatings and everything else. So he was fairly sickly. And obviously having a physician with him was important. And I think maybe Luke would use this opportunity in the ports to get some added care that Paul might need along the voyage. So a lot of interesting there, but he was given that consideration and allowed to go to friends that were in that port. So they'd be in that port for the day. And then it tells us, from there, we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Okay, so here we're getting a taste of what occurs while they sail like they do. So they leave Sidon. They don't go. They're going to Rome. You think they take out across the Mediterranean to get out here to Rome, but they go to Cyprus and they go around the coast, is what Luke's going to tell us. Because the winds were contrary, the time of year they're going is probably in August or so, because we know the feast is coming up in October. We're going to talk about that again. They say the prevailing winds in the summer were from the west. So if they're from the west, the prevailing winds are from the west, coming from left to right. What's going to happen if you go straight into the winds? Yeah, it's not going to be good, is it? Prevailing winds out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea are dangerous, to say the least. You don't go against the headwinds. And those powerful engines they had on those boats weren't going to help, were they? No, it was sails. These were sailboats. And And we saw a picture of that in the video. These were sailboats. The winds, that's a battle. So the winds were contrary. They're already starting to become contrary this time of the year. They're getting close to a point in time where it's not proper time to be traveling or sailing. And we're going to see that occur as we get. So the winds were contrary. So what do? They're going to go along the coast. So what does it provide for them by going along the coast? Some what? Some protection. Yeah. What'd you say, Mike?
I said
Smoother shelter from the winds, isn't it? Because they come along the coast, they get a little shelter from the winds because they're going to have these ports. They're going to have this island that's going to protect them from the winds. They're going to sail behind this island. This is where the problems are going to occur. But you're going to see they're going to come along the coast. And right now, the ship that they're in is just a coastal ship. It's just a coastal ship. Okay, so it's going to tell us that they've got to wait in port to find a cargo ship that can sail across the ocean, okay? So they're initially not in a ship that can even sail across the ocean. They're just in a cargo ship that's going to sail along the coast, and they're going to get to Myra, as we're going to see here in a second. So obviously this special, want to go back to this passage a second. This special consideration, they say that typically in port, the prisoners would be chained below in the bow of the boat. So they would not be allowed to leave, obviously. They remain chained on the boat. But Paul, again, was given preferential treatment. Paul?
Randy, do you think possibly that Luke went with him because they wanted Paul to get to Rome because he was sent there to see Caesar? They wanted to keep him kind of healthy to get there?
That could be a likely point, and Paul, if Luke said, hey, I'm Paul's physician, I want to travel with him, and his condition, good point, maybe say, well, we want him to get there healthy. So you're right, Paul, that's a good point. I'm sure Luke made him aware he's a physician. We're going to see that later. Luke's the physician and he comes in handy on the ship. Comes in handy that Luke's on the ship. Steve?
Read that second leg of that voyage is roughly how long?
I'm sorry, Steve?
The second leg of that voyage that they're on now is roughly how far?
From where they're going now to this little port. Now, I think it took them, I have a note in here, Steve. I think it's going to take them like 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
2 weeks to get there.
So they probably weren't in a little boat like we seen earlier, that 40-foot thing.
Probably is a little bit bigger. It's not going to be the big cargo ship. We're going to share some information on that here in a second. That's going to go out in the ocean, but you're right. It was probably a little bigger boat, with prisoners on it and all. But from what I've read, from 10 days to 2 weeks, possibly in that time frame, that it took them to sail just along the coast. So, and we'll see a little more time frame. Good question. We'll see a little more time frame on some of that as we get into some more of the text and look some more of it, because Luke's going to give us a pretty good step as to each of these ports they're going to go into here in a second. So, yeah, great thought. So we get the idea, we get the impression, these winds are a problem. So you're sailing the ship, and most of these ships, the owner is the captain of the ship, typically, is what they say. Most of these cargo ships, we're going to see it comes up from Egypt. We're fixing to see this, the cargo ship they're going to get on. But most of the owners of the ship are the captains of the ship. So they definitely have a vested interest in what's going to happen on their ship. So let's look at the next part of the passage, and we'll come back to the map. So they're going to leave Sidon, come around Cyprus, and then we're going to see here, they're going to go, we have said, and when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia, Pamphylia, we landed in Myra and Lycia. So here's how we go. Here's how they go. So it says I'm sorry. I'm going to give you a headache, aren't I? Going the wrong way. Okay. So passage says, along the coast of Cilicia, here we go, Cilicia's here, on the coast, Pamphylia, okay, that's where they're traveling, and landed at Myra, in Lycia. Okay, so here's where we are. They've sailed here, Steve, I've heard from 10 to 14 days, a couple of weeks. They're guarding themselves from the wind, so they're getting a little better travel time here. So they're trying to protect themselves from those contrary winds. That's the reason they're going along the coast. So we see that that's where they're at. There, now, remember, here's Egypt. Now, Egypt's fixing to come into play here because the ships from Egypt, Egypt was the primary provider of grain to Rome. That's Rome's primary provider of grain was Italy. So Italy would have these huge cargo ships that would take grain to Rome. And so we're going to find out here, Egypt has a cargo ship that's leaving from Alexandria. They're going to travel north this way to protect themselves from what? From the winds. Okay. So they said typically this is how the cargo ships would go. They would go north and try to cut across to try to protect themselves from the winds. So we're going to see that. Let's look at that in this text in the next part of the passage. So there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship from Alexandria, Egypt, we just saw. He finds this ship in the harbor from Alexandria, Egypt. It's a cargo ship sailing for Italy. And he put us on it. Okay. Here's where they change ships, Steve. Here's where they're going to go to the big ship that's more seaworthy for transport across the sea. Okay. So we're going to go in the big ship. Dr. Manor gave us some ideas of this, but even Josephus writes about these cargo ships. I'll share something he writes. Josephus writes that one of these could hold up to 600 persons, large ships. I thought I put the dimensions on here. I don't think I did. I should have wrote that on here. But cargo ships of wheat, I said grain of wheat going to Rome. Myra was a principal port on the route of the grain ships traveling from Egypt to Rome. Ships could not sail against the winds. We talked about that. So they would head north to Myra and from there make their trip to Italy. The cargo ship of wheat, like I said, could hold up to 600 persons. We know in verse 37, which we won't look at today in Acts 27, we know from that passage there's 276 people on this cargo ship. And again, these were not transport. They didn't have transport ships. Cargo ships would carry people. You could pay to have passage on the ship, or Rome. It says that Rome would actually contract some of these ships or hire these ships to haul their prisoners. And that's what happens here. So we're told in verse 37, there's 276 prisoners on this ship with Paul. So it's a large cargo ship. And so they're there. They are moved to this ship that's heading to Rome. So the centurion and his men, they get on this Alexandrian ship. And when we had sailed slowly, they're on the ship, when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived at Sidus. Since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed until the shelter of Crete, under the shelter of Crete, the Salmone. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Okay, so let's go back to our map. And so the passage tells us we sailed slowly for many days. They're leaving Myra. They sailed slowly for many days, and they get to Cnidus. Okay, since the winds did not permit us to go further, they couldn't go any further. They couldn't come out across here. So since they couldn't go any further because of the winds, it wouldn't permit us, we sailed under the shelter of Crete. What does that mean, sailed under the shelter of Crete? I heard somebody say something. Because the winds, yeah. So you see, the island would actually give them some blockage from the winds directly. So to sail under the shelter of Crete, they kind of go this direction so they can be protected from the winds, off to Salmone. And with difficulty sailing past it, even sailing past it, okay, they're going to come past it, even with more difficulty, Luke writes, sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens. Here's where they're going to wind up, which was near the city of Lasea. Okay, they're having a tough time already, you know, and Luke continues to tell us, okay, we traveled here with difficulty. We got some shelter here, but then we travel a smaller distance and we are having even more difficulty. Sailing past it, they couldn't, with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place they wanted to go further, but they wanted to go further, but they're going to stop here. Okay. Thoughts or comments? Hopefully it helps us have the visual. This is quite a voyage, not a voyage any of us would have probably wanted to be on. Sure, the what?
Not that time of year.
Not that time of year for sure. And there's probably not a time where the seas are calm at all. They're just looking for a calmer time. They're just kind of gauging the winds to find out when's there a calmer time. And we're going to see that in their anticipation of what they want to do next. You know, what are we going to do? Because now they're out here off this island of Crete in this area, and they're going to find out they're in a place that's not a good place to stay for the winter. Okay, we're getting close to a point in time where there's some big decisions that's going to have to be made on what's going to happen with this ship. Lasea, where they're at now, is too small to winter because they're ports. You know, they'd have these ports, and you saw the port of Caesarea. It had that kind of rock ledge, the port where you could get a ship in. It'd be protected from the winds and the waves some. Well, the port they're in now doesn't have that kind of protection. So it's going to come to their discussion. We need to get somewhere where our ship will be protected if we have to winter. We need to get to a larger port that can protect our ship. And so that's where we're getting to a point where that discussion is going to come up. So here's where they're at the Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. So the next part of the passage, so we're going to start seeing some of the discussion they have. When considerable time had passed, they were there for some time. The voyage was now dangerous. They're there waiting to see if the winds are going to change or lay some to where they can make an attempt. When we've been there a considerable amount of time, the voyage was now dangerous. Here's the time of year we're going to get into here in a minute. Since even the fast was already over. Okay, here's where we have, scholars kind of think we have a time frame when this occurred. The fast was already over. The fast of the feast would have been in a look at the date of this year when the feast would have come, because the Jews were told when to have the feast. And they said this would have occurred in this year, AD 59. The feast occurred at October the 5th. So the feast had already occurred. So now we're into October. Okay, and it said, they also say that from September, dangerous seasons for sailing the Mediterranean occurred sometime between September and mid-November. After mid-November, sailing ceased until spring. Constant overcast skies made navigation impossible, plus the winds. So here we are in October, a little after October. We're in that range to where by mid-November, you don't sail anymore. So things are really getting hazardous. They're getting dangerous. So that's kind of how we can go back and get the time frame in history. We can get a date of when these things occurred. I think it's really important for us to look at that. It's kind of interesting to see that. We see that date and kind of tell that this is a dangerous time. That's why that time frame can tell us this is a hazardous time to be on a ship. It's coming up. So, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Now, I think I wrote it down. Luke in Acts records Paul was an experienced sailor, not that he ran the ships, but Luke has recorded 11 voyages that Paul's been on in his travels, from the first to second to third missionary journeys, the time Paul would be on a ship. There's about 11 different times Paul has been on the sea. And obviously Paul inspired man, but he has experienced the sea before, hadn't he? And so he's aware of the dangers. And so he admonishes them and lets them know that we're getting into a dangerous time now. And again, here the captain is the owner of the ship. So there's going to be some discussion about what they are to do. So verses 11 and 12. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship by what was being said by Paul. So who would you listen to? Are you going to listen to the guy that captains the ship and that's the sailor? Or are you going to listen to this old Jewish man who is under arrest? I'm sorry? Pilot of the ship's going to tell you what to do. So Paul has made his concerns, obviously, to the centurion, and maybe the others, there's some scholars you may read that said this might have been a public meeting on the ship. We don't know, but Paul was included. Well, he's going to listen to the captain of the ship, the centurion, to the captain. In verse 56, because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So here's where the decision comes, and we'll pick up here next week. Here's what's going to happen in the next part of their travels. Okay, they've said, okay, we need to go, if we can get to Phoenix, there's a better port there, and we can possibly winter our ships there. So that's what they've decided to do, to harbor there if they can get there. Paul's warning them that's even dangerous. It doesn't look that far to us. I'm not sure. I think it said it's, I don't have the mileage on that, but it's still a hazardous, going to be a very hazardous trip to leave here and to gauge that ship to try to get to Phoenix. So they're going to do that. They're going to set out for Phoenix, and we're going to see that that's where disaster strikes. So next week, we'll pick up from there. Interesting aspects of what happens on this voyage and what Paul has to endure, and Luke and the others on board. So we'll pick up there next week. If you're reading Long and True for the Day, the pages next week will be 457 to 475, 457. So read along that. I know we kind of stopped you right there. It's a cliffhanger. Of course, you know the result, but you might read the rest of the chapter when we have some good discussion next week. So thanks for your good comments and attention this morning.
But later on, Paul said, you should listen to me.